Hello, this is Professor Williams. I wanted to go back and just revisit social work practice with families. And when I started working with families, I wish there was a few things I knew before I got started. These are 10 tips that I think are really important for you to remember as you go on to do social work practice with families. Even if you plan to work with individuals or communities, you're always working with families. Families are integral to the work that we do because we work with family systems. If you're working with one single adult person, you might find that they talk about their family a lot. Or you might find that if you're doing community work, there's several different families represented in the work that you're doing. And so we always have to think about family. So it's very important to be mindful of these tips. And so as far as working with a family around their needs, resource mobilization is really important. If you think back to our terms, you know from Maslow's hierarchy of needs that resource mobilization involves helping a client obtain physiological needs and safety needs first. You have to address these before anything can be done effectively with the family. Even if we know that there's really issues with intimate relationships or people are feeling like they have low self-esteem or they feel unfulfilled in their life, if those physiological and safety needs aren't met, those basic needs, we're not able to do the work that we want to do with them. So, for example, I was working with a family, I'll call them the Brown family, and I came to address the truancy of the 15-year-old in the house. But what I learned was that the parents were working really long and odd hours to try to maintain their housing. They were at risk of foreclosure and they wanted to get extra money to try to save their home. So the 15-year-old became responsible for caring for the younger children. When the parents realized that the 15-year-old was missing a lot of class, they would have other family members come and watch the younger children so the older child could go to school. But the 15-year-old felt so responsible for his family that he was cutting class and cutting school to go try to do extra work, odd jobs on the side, to try to make money for the family. And so without that basic physiological need being met, there was no work we could really do to help this child with his truancy. So again, that's something that we just want to be thinking about as we offer support to families. So we want to assess every family that we meet in the following areas: in structure, ethnicity and culture, their life cycle stage, the emotional climate of the family, the boundaries, and the communication patterns of the family. So this will look familiar as we already talked about how these areas impact families and from your reading in chapter 7 from the Poolin text. But just as a brief overview, the structures is regards to the name, the organization of people in the family. We want to ask the family who they consider to be part of the family system, because there might be people who aren't present that they do consider important in the family system: grandparents, neighbors, half or step siblings. That means that we need to be thinking about including them in treatment. Sorry about that. Ethnicity and culture is important because that involves possessing a set of beliefs and rules based on the based on the factors that we want to assess. What the beliefs and rules are about how they interact with boundaries and how they interact emotionally can be very much based on ethnicity and culture. And remember, this is more than just race or class. We know a family in South Philadelphia is going to be very different from a family from a rural farm, maybe in Lancaster County. And so those two types of families, we have to take into account the culture that they would have in working with them. And remember, ethnicity and race are not the same thing. So I was referred to work with a family that was an African American family on paper, because the teachers at the school felt that the child might be autistic, or they felt that he was not being respectful because he wouldn't look them in the eye. When I met with the father and stepmother, what I learned was that they were actually from another country. They were from a country in Africa, and they were taught and they believed that children looking adults in the eye was actually considered rude. And so we had to share with the school that this child was not in need of further assessment around that lack of eye contact, because that was a cultural thing that was happening for that child. Also, the parents were upset with the child because they felt that he was being disrespectful to them. He would wake up in the morning and not say hello to them. And in their culture, that was very important, that children greet adults when they wake up and come downstairs and see adults in the home. And he had been doing it for many years and then suddenly had stopped. Well, what I found out later was that that child's biological mother actually was an African American woman. And he would go and visit her family. He had recently become reunited with them. And so he would go on the weekends and visit them from time to time. And in their household, he didn't have to say hi in the morning. That wasn't something that they required from him. They would come and greet him first. And so he stopped saying hello in the morning. And so we had to talk about the nuance of culture and how American culture, that's not typical for families necessarily, that a child would greet the adults first. So ethnicity and culture is very important in making assessment. Again, we want to think about the life cycle stage. We want to think about if they're a single adult just moving out, if they're joining, there's a joining of the families through marriage, families with young children, families with adolescents, if they've launched children from the home, or if they're a family in later life. But we all know that traditionally families maybe adhered to that life cycle, but modern family, that's not the way things typically happen. So you might be doing hospital social work, and you might be working with a middle-aged adult who lives on their own. Maybe they're in their mid-30s, but they recently had a health issue. So you're going to need to reach out and find out what family members can provide support to this patient when they're discharged from the hospital. So we still might have to work with the family, even if it's presented as an individual, because not every person gets married, not every person has children, but we have to be thinking about who is around them that can provide support. The emotional climate, are they enmeshed or disengaged? Is there love, warmth, and harmony, or is the family atmosphere kind of hostile and tense? But remember, this also can be based on culture. So how we assess if someone falls into any of these categories has to be combined with how we understand the rest of these factors. For example, I worked with a family from a country that was Eastern in culture, and the older adult parents decided who their adult child should marry. Their daughter was 30 some years old, but she had to ask their permission before she could marry this person, and they were not in agreement, and that had presented a major issue within the family structure. So again, we have to monitor enmeshment versus disengagement, if it's a loving, harmonious family, if it's hostile or tense, but we have to take into account these other factors. So again, internally, boundaries look like enmeshment or disengagement. You can refer to chapter 7 in the Poolin text to look at more information about what that means exactly, if you have questions or if you don't remember that discussion. But externally, some families have very open boundaries. So they may have a lot of friends and family visits. People come to the home, they go to other people's home. Maybe they're pretty active in the community. Or they might have closed external boundaries. So maybe no one visits and they don't visit anyone else. Maybe they're not really involved with others. They go to work, school, come right back home. They don't talk about what happens at home, outside of home. Everything stays in. Some families have kind of a random boundary when it relates to the external world. Maybe the one child has friends and relationships outside of school, and he doesn't talk about those relationships at home. He doesn't talk about family with those relationships. It's like he has this whole other world that no one else in the family might know about. The father might have a whole other group of people that he engages with that no one in the family really knows these people. They may not know that those people exist. So sometimes people have kind of random sort of involvements externally, and they don't relate at all back to the family. And that's just something that we want to assess and be aware of. So communication patterns is really important. How often does a family talk? How do they talk to one another? Who talks to whom? And are the messages congruent? If I tell you I love you, and I'm the parent speaking to a child, does my body language say that? If I say, oh no, the parent tells you, I'm really close to my child, and you notice that whenever you come to the house, the child never sits next to the parent, doesn't say a word to the parent, are they really close? What exactly does that mean? So let me give you a scenario. Let's say you're called to the home due to concerns of parental neglect, and the parent tells you that they're not neglectful. The people who reported them are incorrect. They're very involved and they have a lot of authority and knowledge of what their children are doing and how their children's lives are managed. And then while you're in the home, you notice that the phone rings and it's one of the younger children. And the younger children ask the younger child that calls asks the parent, "Can I speak to my older sibling?" And so that parent gives the phone to their teenage child. And that young child that called the house asks the teenager, "Can I stay out later?" And the teenager says, "Yes, you have my permission to stay out later." They never talk to the parent at all. They just talk to the teenager and the teenager gives them permission. What might that type of communication tell you about that family? So we also want to be mindful to stay neutral. Avoid aligning yourself with parents, children, or grandparents because there's often family conflict when we arrive in the home, and the family will tell you all their problems and their conflicts, and you will want to take sides. Maybe you'll want to say that the parent is right, or the child is right, or the grandparent is right. But it's very important that you just stay focused on the task at hand. You want to talk about what's going on with the child's safety or the parent's health or whatever reason you've been called to the house. You don't want to get into the middle of family disagreements. And even if you are trying to work through the family conflict with them, if you take sides, that can actually cause more challenges with your work in the family. So this can be pretty tricky. But it's a nuance that you learn as you continue to work with families. Poulin does a little bit of a discussion about that in that particular chapter, so you may want to go revisit that. Another thing that's important is not to disempower parents in front of the children. So sometimes children will try to talk to you or ask you for things that have to do with the way that they're being parented or the rules in the house. And we want to be mindful not to overstep the parents' authority in the home, even if we don't agree. We might want to be creative in the way that we address it with the parent so that it doesn't involve the child. Here's an example. Let's say that you are a social worker who has been called to the home because the parent is in danger of losing their custody of their child due to medical neglect. The child has very high blood sugar levels. They have diabetes and they've been hospitalized several times. The hospital tells you that if this child's blood sugar continues to go up, their life is at risk. You go to visit the family and the child's eating candy. As soon as you walk in the door, you notice that the child is doing this and the parent doesn't say anything. But you're worried because you know the child's blood sugar is a problem. The child, in the middle of the session, turns and asks the parent for more candy, and the parent says yes and gives them a bag of candy. What would you do in that situation to handle that without disempowering the parent? So we also want to note any bad seed versus golden child dynamics. So let me explain what this means. Sometimes you will work with the family and they might have two different children. And they'll say, "Oh, this child is the problem child. They're the bad seed. They're the ones that cause all the problems. They're cutting up in school. They're acting up in the community. They cause problems in the house. If this child didn't act this way, we wouldn't have any problems. My other child is perfect. They're the golden child. They are well behaved. They're very respectful, very helpful. I wish that my other child could be like them." If the family says things like this, they're sending you the message that they want you to fix the bad seed or that problem child. And they will say that because they want you to focus in on that. But what we need to be mindful of is that we think systemically as social workers. We believe that any behaviors a child has is actually an indication of what's happening in the family system. It's not just a bad child. For example, children of parents who abuse drugs and alcohol, one child often takes on the role of the child that acts out or the rebel. And they do that because they're acting out the tension and the conflict within the family around this parent's drug use. Or by them acting out, it gives the parent something to focus on if there's a lot of conflict in the parental relationship. And so what we know is that if you just focused on that bad child or that bad seed, quote unquote, then we're going to miss the real issue in the family system. I believe as a family therapist that a child's behavior is telling you something about what's happening larger in the family. It's never just happening because a kid is just a bad kid. What we also know is that that golden child actually, or the child that the parent says is perfect, probably does have their own challenges. Sometimes the child who's the perfect child or the golden child might grow up to end up going to therapy later because they have issues of anxiety or feeling like they have to be perfect all the time, or feeling resentful because they didn't really get seen by their family because everything was focused on the child with the behavioral issue. So whenever you hear a family talking about that sort of thing, pay attention to it, but don't fall into that pattern. Don't agree with the family too quickly. Do more assessment to figure out what's really happening. And reach out to missing family members. So this might be a missing parent, a relative that's talked about frequently, but is not present in any family sessions, someone who lives in the home, but is never there whenever you meet with the family. These people are important to the family system, and unless that there's an issue of safety, like there was some abuse or some violence between those family members, you should work to try to have the family invite that person who's not there or to reach out to that person. This can be somewhat tricky. Let me give you an example. Let's say you're working with a mother and a stepfather and they have a 10-year-old son. You're called to work with the family because of the child's behavioral issues. Let's say mom tells you that her and the biological father broke up because the father cheated on the mother when the child was 4 years old. She took the son and she left the father. And she told the father that he needed to go to court to set up visitation because she was not going to bring him around otherwise. The biological father never follows up with going to court. But now mom is remarried. She says that her child has a really good relationship with the stepfather, that he doesn't miss his biological father and doesn't want the father to be involved. You have an individual session with the child, and the child talks nonstop about his biological father, and he even starts to cry and say how much he misses him. What would you do? How would you handle that situation? So we need to check in regarding adult intimate relationships, friends, romantic relationships. Again, even if you're working with a single adult, who's in their life that they feel that they are connected to and supported by? Are the caregivers supported? Do they get date night if they're parents? If they're caring for an older adult, do they get breaks away from the older adult where they're able to go out and fulfill some other aspect of their life? I'm not talking about work, and I'm not talking about obligations in the community, like if they have to work on a community council or if they have to go to the gym to work out for their health. I'm not talking about that. Who else loves this person? Where else do they get fulfilled? Are they having sex? Are they having romance? Are they having friendships where they can just go and hang out with someone? Are they getting their physical needs met as far as, are they buying clothes for themselves? Or are they getting their hair done, getting their nails done? Are they able to just go for a drive or go for a run? Those sorts of things are important. Every caregiver in a family needs at least two good people to back them up to provide support. Maybe somebody to assist with finances or to take over caring for the child or caring for the older adult if they need a break. People need this in their life, and we need to ask about how they're doing and not just assume that it's all about the kids or it's all about the older adult caregiver and the older adult that they're taking care of and that they're totally fine. When working with young children, include the family often. Young children don't have control over their lives. So someone might send the child, the quote unquote bad seed, to work with you, and the parents won't even come in the session. They'll tell you, oh, I don't need to be there because this kid is the problem. But we know that that really means that there's something going on in the family system. So don't just refer the child to individual therapy. Ask the parent to make sure they're involved in that therapy. If you're sitting and having a meeting with the child, make sure that you also meet with the parent as well. It's very important because young children can't control their family system. You won't see change if you don't address the adults involved. Develop informal and formal supports for a family overall, so not just for the adult caregivers, but especially important if the parent is a single parent. It's really important that we get other people involved so that people have other relationships outside of just depending on each other all the time or only dealing with each other all the time. I've had some of the best results working with families, sometimes just making referral to after school programs or helping the child get involved in sports, helping the parent be referred to a parent group or groups for adult caregivers, getting them involved in a faith community, or getting other families in the neighborhood to walk the child to school or watch the child after school. Sometimes family members aren't speaking to each other, or friends might not be speaking to the parent anymore because they had a fight with their friend. You might want to help them think about rebuilding those relationships because informal and formal supports are key to helping families. Keep an eye on tension within the families. Families often argue with each other, they get upset with each other, and those tensions can get pretty high. Think back to when you were younger and you would argue and fight with maybe if you had siblings or younger cousins. Those fights seemed really, really intense at that time. Maybe later you're able to reflect on it differently. But the family relationships are so close that those types of tensions can get very, very high and sometimes even lead to physical or verbal violence with one another. Collaborate with the leaders of the family or else. This is related to family structure. Who's really in charge? If you're working with a teenage parent, you might want to check in with the adults that they're living with. Are they living with with their parent? That teenage parent, grandma might have more power over what happens with their child than the teenage parent does. If an older adult you're working with and one of the children calls for your services, you might want to check to make sure that child is the one who really has the most power. It might be another child who really has the most influence over the adult parent or is really providing all the care, but maybe that one sibling is the one who just reached out to you. Which parent carries the most power? Sometimes the parent that might be quiet or seems least involved or may not even come to sessions when you come to the house might actually be the one who carries the most power. You have to assess to find out who it really is, or else you will not get cooperation from the family no matter how much you try. So questions for discussion I want you to think about. Number 1 from the family assessment slide, go back to slide number 2. What information does that scenario tell you about the family communication and the family structure? From slide 3, staying neutral, how would you handle that situation without disempowering the parent? And number 3, go to missing family member slide, number 6. Remember that scenario I raised? How might you work with that family?